Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us. Just a few announcements as we get started. First, we are recording the session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is also where you can engage with other attendees. We also kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. So it looks like we're ready to get started. So I'm going to hand it over to Molly Hunter to begin.
Great, thanks, Jessica. And thank you all for joining the part 2 of our session on the nexus of climate change and fire. This morning, we heard really a national perspective on the issue and heard from several leaders in science organizations that are addressing partnerships and collaborations and funding interdisciplinary science. And now we're going to shift gears and really get into sort of the practice of how science is applied on the ground and incorporation of Indigenous perspectives. And then we'll hear from a panel of practitioners and managers who are doing innovative work in this field. So starting off this session, we have Rachel Lohman, who's a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. And she's going to talk specifically about some of these complex modeling work that she does of future scenarios and how that can be incorporated in land management. So I'll kick it over to you, Rachel. You want to go ahead and share your screen?
Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay. Did that work for everyone?
Looks great.
Okay, and I am going to turn my video off after I say hi, just to save bandwidth because I've been cutting in and out. So hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk, and I'll disappear now for you. So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about some ideas for and some examples of incorporating future scenarios into land management. And so I'll kick it off by, sorry about that, talking a little bit about what fires are likely to be in the coming decades that make scenarios in management useful, and also make the practice of developing scenarios and implementing management actions based on scenarios really challenging. So this is that fires that we're seeing are becoming more frequent, sometimes overlapping, depending on the system, maybe more severe or a larger component of high severity. Fires can be harder to predict and control than in the past. They're a major driver of environmental change. We've heard about that during this conference, and many of you have probably seen that firsthand. Fires can pose risks to human communities and human health. And fires in the 21st century, whether we're looking at current fire occurrence or in the next 80 or 90 years, are a big challenge in terms of modeling the risk, the behavior, and also short and long-term ecological impacts. And the complexity of fire prediction and incorporating fire, vegetation, and climate into a conceptual or a true modeling framework is illustrated by this graphic on the right. This is from a project called Southwest Fire Climb that was mentioned earlier in the previous session segment. And in that project, we developed this set of linkages among the components of the climate system, fire regimes, and vegetation. Those linkages are the black lines. This is a simplified version, but this is the ecological complexity that kind of underpins our ability and our need to predict fire in the 21st century. And this is part of what constrains our ability to develop, true, accurate predictions, because the ecological world is messy. And so that's what we're dealing with. So challenges in modeling fire, climate, and vegetation are related to this complexity, all of those black lines connecting all of those boxes. We also have uncertainties in future climates. So if you read something like the IPCC report, which is based on different emission scenarios, you'll know that there's not one future climate, there are several families of scenarios that drive climate models that operate at varying scales that all describe this future climate. So we don't have one climate future we have, at least in terms of what we can incorporate into models, it could be dozens or even more types of future climate we could incorporate. We have challenges of no analog responses of species and ecosystems at varying spatial and temporal scales. So the way that plants and animals respond to ongoing disturbance is different than may have existed in the past, and the relationships among components of ecosystems are different. We have a big mismatch in the spatial scale of disturbances, from the global climate signal to big regional fires, versus the capacity of management to do something about some undesired condition. So a stand versus a global scale, it's a hard one to reconcile. There's not one answer for all places, and there's a limited ability to project or apply complex simulations from one place to another place because of the heterogeneity of ecosystems and responses. And then in the management world and in the natural world, we have to think about the consequences of being wrong in terms of our model projections. And so all those things make it quite hard to think about how to incorporate complex models into management. And that's sort of where this idea of plausible future scenarios comes in. So a plausible future scenario, and this is the first bullet point is my favorite one, is a way to explore the future with credibility and saliency. So that means to develop some believable version of the future that can be used in management. A plausible future scenario has to have enough supporting evidence to be considered plausible or possible. And a scenario is a way to consider how something that's really complex might change over time, and also a way to prepare for a future that is unknown, but is also worrisome enough to make it worth considering. So I was trying to think of a framework for sort of how we could incorporate ideas of plausible future scenarios into our thinking about the natural world and the managed natural world. And there's a thing that's been used in risk management for human health, for economics, for social systems. It's called Jacobson's window. And this is Jacobson's window. So it combines, it's sort of a Punnett square that combines two different sorts of assessments. So one is the likelihood that something's going to occur. So that likelihood, could be on a continuum, but if we want to bookend it, we could say the likelihood of something occurring can be high or it can be low. And then there's the consequences of that event if it occurs. And those consequences could be, low or high, or you could think of them as, inconsequential or severe. And when you, just like you would in a Punnett square, if you combine or if you look at all the different combinations, you might find that if likelihood is low and the consequences are low, that might be a place where management action is not as essential as a condition where the likelihood of something occurring is high and the consequences of that thing occurring are also, if that thing occurs, the consequences are very severe or impactful. So the question is, how do you figure out, if we're thinking about climate drivers of wildfire and wildfire drivers of ecological change, how do we figure out where these combinations of consequence and likelihood exist? So if we're thinking about a change in forest composition, how do we know what its likelihood is? And then how do we know what the consequences of some, stand level change are for the broader landscape? And this is where the use of complex models comes in and is really useful, because each one of these squares could be considered sort of a scenario that you build into a model. When you look across a range of scenarios, 5 different climates, 3 different management alternatives, you can begin to sort of flesh out this Punnett square, this Jacobson's window. So, I'm going to talk today. I'm going to give some examples of a way to look at plausible future scenarios with a complicated model, a complex model. That model is FIRE-BGC version 2. It's a model that combines climate changes with fire behavior and fire impacts, all on real world landscapes, incorporating individual trees that scale to stands, that scale to ecological sites, that scale to entire spatially complex landscapes, up to 200 or 250 hectares in size. It's a model that runs over long time scales from 100 to 500 to 1,000 years if we so choose. And before we get into some examples, there's an important thing to point out about models, and models range in complexity from very simple models that make projections at a point level to this FIRE-BGC model, which is one of the more complex, that operate at these broader, very broad spatial scales. But there's always a trade-off in modeling between simple models and complex models, and there's a continuum of those. But simple models are easy to use. They don't require much development or perhaps much training for the user, but their inference is somewhat limited. Sometimes they don't contain interacting processes, or sometimes they don't consider spatial processes, or they're point-based, or they include just a few parameters, or they're deterministic. So you always get the same answer, but with a limited set of parameters. In contrast, complex models provide a lot of new information that you may not have had at the beginning of the modeling, but the investment in the complex modeling process is high. Sometimes it requires supercomputers, it requires training. It's great job security for those of us who use these kinds of models. And again, the information that we get can be information that's not available from any other source, because the model can do more complex things and produce emergent behaviors that we sometimes couldn't imagine with a thought experiment. So a model like FIRE-BGC, an ecosystem fire process model, integrates components of ecosystems. So something like vegetation, biomass, carbon, individual species, composition, distribution, with the processes that affect those components. So climate drivers, incremental or daily weather, fire, pests, pathogens, beetles, whatever the thing is. If it's important to the behavior of that system, a complex model should incorporate that process. They're developed to understand and predict the outcomes of complex interactions, with the understanding that we don't necessarily have other ways to get that understanding or to assess those outcomes. Importantly, they extrapolate from the known, and remember this statement, from the known to the unknown. So we take information that we know to be true and we port it to another time and another place. And if they can be used to test management strategies and expand management decision space in a risk-free environment. So if we're wondering what the impacts of a particular treatment might be, or a let it burn strategy, this is a model's a great place to do that, before you decide to do that on the ground. And they can also be used in a particular experimental design to create these plausible scenarios and bracket some of the uncertainties that I talked about before in terms of climate, or even in terms of what future management strategies might be. So I'm going to talk about some plausible future scenarios that are developed for the Jemez Mountains in New Mexico. I work out of the Alaska Science Center of the USGS, but I sit in Albuquerque. So this is in my backyard. It's a landscape where I've worked for a really long time. It's just north of Albuquerque. And it's a landscape that's complex. Ecosystems range from low elevation woodlands up to high elevation spruce fir forests. It's also a landscape that's experienced a great deal of high severity fire over the past couple decades. Overlapping fires, we have the one you may have heard of is the Las Conchas fire. It's been talked about a bunch at this conference already. It's a great living laboratory, but it's also an example of sort of an unanticipated event that has had cascading and potentially persistent consequences for this ecosystem. So the FIRE-BGC model that I mentioned was developed we developed a simulation landscape in the Jemez Mountains here as part of the Southwest Fire Climb project that was funded by a Joint Fire Science Program. This is one component of that project that has, and we have spawned many different directions in Southwest Fire Climb. It continues today, even after the funding life of the project. And this modeling has really been a key component for us to be able to develop some predictions for how climate, fire, and ecological systems in the Southwest might change in the future. And so that's part of what I'm going to show you. So So recall that we talked about different climate scenarios and the fact that we don't have just one climate future. We have some different possibilities. We know that the magnitude and the rate of climate change is, thanks Molly, is important. And so therefore, incorporating multiple climate scenarios in different model runs is a way to assess basically whether there's some convergence at some point, whether there is, an RCP 4.5 climate scenario or 8.5 or something in between. So on the left, I show you some climate scenarios with different endpoints, warm, dry versus hot, arid is how we call them in this project. And then we also have a variety of management scenarios that we incorporate. So business as usual is what the forest is doing today, what the Forest Service is implementing on this Jemez Mountains landscape. And then we tripled and then did a 6-fold increase in that intensity of treatment to see whether different levels of treatment could achieve those desired outcomes that the Forest Service had for this landscape. So in terms of examples of fire response to both climate and management, so you could think of each one of these boxes on the left as a different scenario. They are a different scenario, a combination of climate and a management scenario. The colors are related to the amount of fire that's on the landscape. And I'm running out of time. I always build in too many slides and too much detail, but the take home that I want you to get from here is that climate matters. So RCP 8.5, this hot, arid climate as compared with contemporary climate and warm, dry climate produces more high severity fire years than any of the other scenarios. And that exists regardless of the management strategy that's implemented. So a 6-fold increase in the amount of managed area doesn't change the fact that hot, dry climate drives a much larger component of high severity fire on this landscape. And that's what you see with all those dots in the red box are those giant high severity fire years. So you can't do something like that without having an impact on forest composition and forest structure. The boxes on the far right column of each of these slides show a change with that RCP 8.5 scenario in forest composition and structure, basically a transition to early successional forests and forests that are dominated by non-tree species. If we want to look at where on the landscape our current forests might persist, you can do it with, this is work that I did in cooperation with Sandy Hare from UMass Amherst. So with the pixels, we're looking at areas in the landscape comparing 2026 to 2100 in this modeling world for different climate scenarios, or the hot, arid climate versus contemporary, places where we retain biomass on the landscape. So the dark green pixels are basically the areas where biomass persists. You see there's not much of it in the hot, arid climate as compared with contemporary climate. And then the colored dots on the lower panels indicate different species and where they persist on the landscape. So again, with this hot, arid climate versus contemporary climate, we're losing biomass of lots of our existing tree species, and the places where they occur on the landscape is changing. So in terms of what we can learn from scenarios for management, just taking this example, we can ask, does climate trajectory matter? And in this instance of this Jemez Mountains landscape, and in every instance, every landscape where we've incorporated these plausible future climate scenarios into modeling, the answer is yes. Climate trajectory absolutely matters. So with hot, dry climate, we see changes in forest distribution, structure, and composition, and more high severity fire, with the caveat that exists until fuels become limiting. We can also ask whether model treatments prevent unwanted departures or maintain desired conditions under future climates. And in this case, and in many other cases where we've done this kind of complex modeling, the answer is that the current rate of application, and even this sort of out of box thinking in terms of the amount, an increase in the amount of management action on the landscape at a certain point doesn't have much impact at a landscape scale. So that's that scale mismatch of treatments versus driving ecological processes. And then we can ask whether shifting climate and fire regimes, if we're not able to maintain desired conditions with current management, require novel management approaches. And this gets back to that idea of the safe decision space. So if what we see or what we do on the landscape today isn't working, what do we need to do to develop new scenarios or new strategies? And the modeling world is where we can start to do that, to really expand the toolbox, to expand the decision space, to think, not just outside the box, but maybe beyond boxes altogether. And I wanted to end with a slide that summarizes some challenges, but then also some science needs. So challenges are accounting for this idea of a no analog future. So if we have phenomena for which we have no historical reference, it's really hard to build or to understand, to build a flexible model. And so we have to change sort of the way that we build flexibility into models to be able to account for these no analog conditions. We have disturbance synergies and feedbacks that are very important. So reinforcing or amplifying behaviors. A great example is the relationship of climate and fire, and connected by fuel aridity, fuel condition. We have physiological thresholds and ecological tipping points, nonlinear behaviors that mean that we may get to a certain point and see an absolute change in the way a system behaves. We have economics, politics, and social systems that constrain what we can do on the ground in the real world. So in terms of science needs, to be able to start addressing some of these challenges, I always make a plug for what I've been calling 21st century ecology, to provide new baseline data to account for this no analog future. So if we have species that have these threshold behaviors, we need to know to be able to incorporate those thresholds or physiological limits, or even changes in things like water use efficiency that might constrain or affect how species respond to ongoing disturbance. We need to incorporate those into models to be able to have that flexibility. But to do that, we need new baseline data. We also, I think this is a time to be experimental in the way that we apply management on the ground so that we can learn from it. And as a big part of that, and the reason for this session, we have the idea that we could expand our innovation and application to figure out as a collaborative group of practitioners and researchers, some directions for how to use models to guide management into the future. And so with that, I think I have no time for questions, but I'm always happy to answer them offline or if there's time later in the session. So thank you.
Great, thank you for that, Rachel. And there is a link in the chat there to the Southwest Fire Climb website if you want more information about that. And then, yeah, feel free to type a question in for Rachel in the chat, and we can get that answered throughout the session. I think in the interest of time, we need to go on to the next speaker, which is who is Frank Lake, research ecologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station, U.S. Forest Service. And he's going to talk about what we've mentioned throughout the session, the critical need of incorporating Indigenous practices and perspectives in our adaptation. So go ahead, Frank.
All right, can you see my introductory slide?
Looks great. Yeah.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I appreciate again to Molly and to Kevin the invitation and for hosting this session. And I will too also be covering a lot of information here in the next 18 minutes. But really, thanks again. So, really for me, what are some of the climate adaptation strategies to consider and working with the tribal or indigenous communities as far as what are their climate adaptation strategies that include forestry and wildland fire management that are culturally informed, that are based upon indigenous knowledge, our traditional ecological knowledge, those practices that integrate the management of different trees, plants, fungi, and animals to serve the needs of those communities and the broader society. What I'll hopefully, cover during this presentation is that aspect of thinking about habitats and species as critical resources and how that pertains to forestry and wildland fire management opportunities that then increase the opportunity to use prescribed fire and cultural burning as a climate adaptation strategy. And at the core of that, for many of this, built upon the work from the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, working with the Karuk tribe and other tribes in the area like the Yurok tribe, as well as other broader tribes across California and the Pacific Northwest that inform this approach. So really, in characterizing that, the importance of such things as water. For many of the tribes, the connection of fire to water is an important one. You'll also see a lot of work around food security or food sovereignty, basket materials, medicinal plants is an important one. And also thinking about important wildlife species that are used for regalia, that are also important ecological or sociocultural indicators. For many tribes also too, across the North America or across the US and also in British Columbia and other places, but there's also a timber interest there or economic resource that links to those broader stewardship goals and objectives. So for me, my research framework has been, that tribes utilize many species that are emphasized in existing Western science-based climate synthesis. So how do we draw attention to that? And then also taking an interdisciplinary or multiple methods approach to synthesize that available data to identify what the threats and stressors are. And for one thing, at least around climate change and climate adaptation and vulnerability, is either that ascribed or the tribe's sovereign ascribed vulnerability to them and to those resources of importance, and particularly from the lens of how fire affects those habitats or resources of interest. So there's an evaluation process to learn from that. How does that affect, again, a range of species that are used? How do you do that and at what scale? On the social cultural side of it, there's the individual, family, and broader tribal society that talks about climate impacts, particularly through changing fire regimes. Identify and understand the mechanisms or the pathways of disturbance. And for us here in Northern California, we see things like increased persistence and magnitude of drought that affects different pests, and then the fire on those forests and the broader ecosystems in which that landscape or that ancestral territory those tribes include. What are some of the evaluation and assessment processes? I think there's more alignment currently happening between traditional and Western science approaches and Western indigenous knowledge integration around that. And another important thing I'll add to this is, what are your metrics? As a fire scientist, I'm also trying to crosswalk what are the culturally important metrics or indicators in which to evaluate the climate and fire effects. And we have to have alignment around that to be more compatible and align where we're going to be thinking about future scenarios, as Rachel pointed out. So really for me, it's developing a research approach in that full cycle of, what's the best available science created from indigenous and Western knowledge? What are those researchable questions and science support needs? Addressing the metrics and then the methods about going to evaluate and to collect that information, how you go about in your analysis and how you report your findings, and then that best available science to guide management and policy. And then really for tribes, applying that back into their ancestral landscape across jurisdictions as a climate adaptation strategy that really tribes and the society are beneficiaries of that. And for many tribes, that's a form of justice, being able to revitalize and restore and have the repatriation of those cultural burning practices. There's various factors that inform this. A lot of it comes from a bottom-up approach of family-based burning, which I just talked about in another session, but can be scaled up to look at multi-entity jurisdictional projects that come into this framework together, such as the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. But it takes others. And so a lot of the work with the Nature Conservancy, Training Exchange, and the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network is the way in which this is being done in Northwest California for the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. A lot of this is also understanding the intent, having to and being able to work with other scientists and other managers and others willing to come and work with tribes, is knowing that indigenous knowledge guides fire stewardship within those fire-prone ecosystems for fire-dependent species. That cultural burning can be a form of human services for ecosystems that reduce the extreme range of variation and increase resistance and have more moderate level outcomes for what we're seeing maybe as far as those extreme thresholds. And it's the evolution of these cultural fire regimes in the past, now, and into the future that form from indigenous adaptations that form fire-dependent cultures. And that's a good opportunity to evaluate both how fire socioculturally as well as ecologically or environmentally is a factor of consideration as climate adaptation approaches. And that really varies, again, across time and space. There's many different reasons historically for why tribes use fire and for wanting to use fire use today, but there's many other modern approaches, fire risk reduction, increasing wildland fire response. I'll talk about more about the tenets of the cohesive strategy, but very much putting, and for the Karuk tribe and other tribes, putting that very much at the forefront of culture, how that links to tending practices for those resources and fire modification, and then bringing that all together. One of the things that often I think we need to consider is that understanding that these aspects of an indigenous versus natural fire regime and what were the contributing factors that diversified the existing fire regimes now and into the future. Frequency, so often for cultural burning, the specific application of fire for those valued resources for different objectives are also similar objectives to Western managers, but often the more frequent. The seasonality can be really different in the particular habitats, and looking at resistance and resilience of burning different vegetation types or fuel types at different times of the year. There also has to be the emergent science to evaluate and look at the implications of burning at different seasons. For many tribes, this is based on phenology. I know for burning like out in California, before the emergence of, say, oak bud, leaf buds, and other things like that being considered at the time of bird breeding and animal rearing their young, things like that, that really guides the specificity or those ignition strategies for different types of ecosystems and habitats used and focusing on those various resources of species that are used as resources. And then for many tribal people, it's at the core of the responsibility, both kind of more at the family or individual level, but also for tribes as part of their sovereign responsibility in the management of the lands of their ancestral territory across jurisdictions. When working with indigenous knowledge, particularly around cultural fire, recognize that there's different members of the community that hold different types of knowledge. Understand what that responsibility is. There's differences between those that are ceremonial leaders or medicine people for ceremonial, spiritual, and other cultural practices of a religious nature. There's ones linked to subsistence, whether that's hunting, gathering food resources, basketry resources, and there's also for economic opportunities. You know, there's a lot of workforce training, and part of the restoration of forests and returning desired conditions of fire regime also is an opportunity for revitalization and opportunity for tribes as part of those contributing members of that workforce and governance. And so in working with that, you know, really consider that as part of that full portfolio to bring in how you think about fire as a climate adaptation strategy. For the Karuk and for a lot of this, you know, it ties back to the climate adaptation plan, and it does vary across habitats. And so in our area, we look everything from the river at low elevation up to the high true fir forests and more subalpine environments. And at the core of that is a gradient of indigenous fire stewardship for a host of resources. And kind of bringing this together, how does that indigenous knowledge inform not only what species of consideration that you're wanting to retain, but those can often be the drought tolerant fire adapted species that have high cultural uses. It's thinking about those landscape restoration strategies and priorities fitted in this context. I like this good paper on pyrosilviculture that thinks about an approach. Now, if you take this approach and you think about, oh, we're retaining those sugar pines, which are culturally important for ignition sources, for the fuel bed, for food, for medicine, for the oaks that have more climate adaptation and drought tolerant features, but are also more water use efficient. All these things come into this framework that can inform these types of prescription building that lead to more effective implementation and outcomes that we desire through that management. And then ultimately facilitating the reintroduction of prescribed and cultural fire use as that more energetically efficient tool, even thinking about conserving carbon and other valued resources such as threatened and endangered species or other things of interest. For the tribes, you know, it's going to look a little bit different. So when we think about, you know, forest farming, pyrosilviculture, agroforestry, you know, that can be a form of climate adaptation where, again, your knowledge about the mycorrhizal relationship between the soil moisture and the species is through mushrooms. Looking at the species that are foods, looking at the fire effects are all ways that can inform this approach, again, from kind of a small scale to being increased at a larger scale across tribal territories. We often think many cases too is, you know, what's the potential natural vegetation? So in looking at this slide, we have kind of a Sierra Nevada, California, and Klamath Mountain vegetation, potential vegetation type. You have some mix of firs, Douglas fir, pines, oaks, understory species. The top one depicts kind of more of a lightning fire regime. And in the middle one is that same potential area that is nudged more through the seasonality, through the increased frequency. And thinking about the resistance, the resilience, the sequestration of carbon, both on above ground, below ground, you know, light or cooler burning that doesn't volatilize or combust so much material. So you have more biochar and information and material like that that's conserved on the site, or we have the bottom panel that's looking at what happens under fire exclusion and fire suppression that we know is highly vulnerable, has low resistance, and if it has drought, has beetle infestation, has disease, and then has the right opportunity, has the right conditions for, unfortunately, high severity catastrophic fire, then that's detrimental to the whole watershed, as we're seeing, and the tribal and the local communities around that. So how do we look at increasing resistance and resilience and managing more towards the top two panels through these pyrosilviculture as well as these other fire use practices? One of the ways that I'm doing this through the science is a network of plots, and tying things in from ground-based fixed area plots and individual shrubs or macro plots that look at cultural use species and species of ecological importance. But to link that together, and you think about your inventory of not only the trees but the understory shrubs that become your ladder fuels. What is cut and thinned and what is retained, and how do you go about doing that? One of the ways that we're initially looking at this is through the forest visualization simulator simulation system of looking at growth production and stem diameter and things like that, but also having that be more culturally determined and thinking about what are the outcomes, and then actually looking at on the ground, how did that treatment take place after the silvicultural logging? How did it take, what happened after initial fire? And then what's it like to have repeated fire in there as part of that cultural burning strategy? And so in many ways, the restoration of forests and fire regimes and cultural practices can be a form of climate adaptation. It's to restore the structure, composition, and ecological and culturally valuable functions of those forests, as well as other forests and habitat types like shrublands and grasslands. For many tribal communities and indigenous people, it's teaching that traditional knowledge of fire ecology to youth and to adults, and having that guidance from elders and practitioners guiding that. But it's also focusing on key ecosystems or forest types to help you develop that anchor to be able to manage wildfire for resource benefit or those other objectives, or be able to suppress it where you need to, but also be able to use fire other times. And then ultimately have a more functional cultural fire regime that increases stability and predictability at longer term projections, even with some uncertainty in the climate future. This is taking place through this various landscape restoration strategies, looking at where you're determining are the areas that you strategically place your treatments across that landscape, tying in the vulnerability and adaptation planning efforts to that, linking it to the national cohesive strategy where you have resilient landscapes, fire adapted communities, but also for fire dependent cultures for indigenous people, and then thinking about your wildland fire management responses. And again, linking those objectives locally that then have more broader outcomes now and into the future. So here's the area in which we're kind of just going to narrow in the last bit here on Northwest California by the Oregon border, the area of the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership in the homeland of the Karuk tribe, and across two national forests, the Klamath and Six Rivers. It's things like the values like wildland urban interface, protection of life, property, and resources, also sociocultural and economic well-being. I've talked about some of these other aspects of the various types of treatments that you can do that are always going towards promoting drought-tolerant, fire-adapted species, increasing complexity of heterogeneity and complex early seral that reduce that fuel loading and moderate fire effects. One of the last parts I want to kind of include here is being able to look at legacy vegetation as indicators of a former fire regime that can help be nature as teacher to guide us in the future. And so in many cases, because of fire exclusion and suppression and the cessation or the removal of indigenous burning, how do we use these things on the landscape before they're burned up in high severity fire and erased, or through fire suppression activities to guide us, not only how fire was used in the past, but as a way in the future. And so really for the recovery of tribal stewardship practices with diverse partnerships that could benefit tribes, landowners, and the public and society, thinking about a variety of mechanical and manual treatments through that pyrosilvicultural approach, having considerations for those shared resource management values and developing those products and related forest services or ecosystem services, also carbon in mind with that, and having alignment of that locally to cost regions, and really having this also support tribes' climate adaptation strategies for both community and for the environment. This is featured quite well. I had a hand in this, literally, with the Karuk Climate Plan, talking about the various resources here, and also how that is a product of indigenous fire stewardship or cultural burning to achieve that. And then I'm just going to end right here some key resources, some of which I've been contributing author and the work of others that really look at some of the intersection of, again, silviculture, forest management, climate adaptation strategies, and then thinking about returning fire or functional fire regimes that bring that together. Thank you.
Great, Frank. Thanks so much for that. It was really, really interesting, and I really appreciate you joining this session, especially given your involvement in the concurrent session on cultural and Indigenous practices. So thank you very much. You just are at time, so I know Frank has to move on to a different session. So if you have any questions for him, just again put them in the chat, and we'll pass them on to him. So. But again, in the interest of time, I think we'll move on. We'll shift gears to our second panel discussion. And this one is really looking at manager and practitioner perspective. So again, shifting gears to what does it take to actually get climate adaptation implemented on the ground? And these are a group of people that are engaged in some innovative and practices. So, and I'm going to pass it on to Kevin Hires, who's going to moderate the session. He's with Tall Timbers Research Station and U.S. Geological Survey.
It's always hard to follow Frank because he gives such a wonderful perspective on cultural fire. But in order to follow him, I brought an A team of managers and ecologists who represent just an amazing breadth of experience, and are going to give us their thoughts on, how managers and practitioners, what their needs are, and how their needs and activities, can be adjusted in response to adaptation and changing fire regimes. So we will quickly move through all the presenters. I would like to just first say we've got 5 very brief talks, 5 to 7 minutes. We'll let each presenter discuss kind of what their perspectives are, and then we'll open it up to a broad discussion, try to moderate that. So as you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I'll try to pull them forward at the end of all the participants' time. So first, I'd like to introduce Jimmy Fox. He's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge Manager in Fairbanks, Alaska. And Jimmy, if you want to lead us off, take 5 to 7 minutes and start the perspectives on, as a manager who's facing climate change.
Okay, hey, having on audio.
Loud and clear.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the opportunity here. Good to see everyone. The summer of 2019 was the 4th largest fire season since 1960 for the vast Yukon Flats Basin in East Central Alaska. There was an estimated 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions that were released that summer. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency translates that amount of carbon dioxide to 7.5 coal-fired power plants running for 1 full year. Now, it would take 6,000 wind turbines or 36 million acres of U.S. forest 1 year to offset all those emissions. And that's not accounting for what gets later released from permafrost thaw. And globally, permafrost holds about twice the carbon that we have in our atmosphere. So I was asked to discuss briefly what I need and what success looks like. What do I need? As a land manager for 8 million acres of roadless boreal forest over significant permafrost, I can tell you that I need more data, more money, and more people to address fire and the climate emergency. But you already know that. And you just might agree that those things alone will not solve the challenge. The previous speaker, Rachel Lohman, was spot on. The ecological world is really messy. What I'd like you to consider is the idea that in the nexus between fire and climate emergency, there's messy people work to do, work that we'd rather not do, me included. Work not so much kind of in our heads, but really work that's below the neck, work that lives down in our hearts. Work not found in strategic plans, but it's needed to make progress. And this kind of work requires humility, to see my own hubris, to admit I have a distorted view of reality sometimes, humility to see my piece of the mess, to hold equally that I might be right or wrong on what the problem is, or even how to make progress. This kind of work also requires courage to raise tough issues, courage to ask questions, courage to show ignorance, courage to build bridges, courage to find a shared purpose, courage to disappoint people at a rate they can tolerate, courage to surface values that might be in conflict, courage to work with others and identify experiments that we might try together. Again, harking back to something Rachel said. What does success look like? Success looks like people giving up old ways to make room for new ways of being, to become what the times require. Now, on one end of the spectrum, I see individuals learning and applying social science, as well as more of the hard sciences, completing leadership development training, using that knowledge and training to experiment, to skillfully engage others while managing their own strengths, their own vulnerabilities and triggers, energizing others, and along the way, questioning assumptions, reassessing values and loyalties, and what they're willing to give up. At the other end of the spectrum are changes on the ground. And in a place like Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge up in Alaska, rather than accept lightning-caused wildfire as we've done for decades, we might begin to resist fire in places with massive permafrost and carbon stores. We may accept inevitable fire-driven habitat transition in other places. And we may direct habitat transformation with prescribed fire or even reforestation, on-the-ground actions that have been kind of taboo on remote roadless federal lands in Alaska. I'd say we'd also be telling stories about fire and the climate emergency to various audiences. Thank you. I look forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Jimmy. You're on the leading edge of the climate crisis, and really look forward to unpacking some of these questions further with the conversation after our short presentations. I'd now like to turn to Linda Wadley, who is the district ranger on the Coconino National Forest. So we're going to be moving across our geographic breadth represented by this panel. And Linda, I'll turn it over to you for some opening comments.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And how do I sound? And is there a delay still?
Nope, loud and
No.
clear.
Very good. Okay, we'll do the video as long as we can. So thanks very much. First of all, I really want to thank Molly for inviting me and for the FA board, as usual, for putting together such a great Congress. And I'm really honored to be here participating with this panel. I really am thankful for the chance I have for a while to focus on my passion. I'm not employed as a fire ecologist anymore, but maybe once you are one, that never goes away. I sure hope so. So currently I'm the district ranger in the Mogollon Rim District of the Coconino National Forest. We are in northern Arizona. My district happens to be about 40 miles south of Flagstaff, Arizona. I am certainly right in the middle, plop down in the middle of the Ponderosa Pine Forest, one of the largest in the world that you hear about so often. And of course, as I'm speaking to many fire ecologists, when we hear Ponderosa Pine, we often think of the fire regime being very high frequency and low severity. I've worked around the country in fire management. Many of the Western states have been in wildfires, burned in many of them, burned in Florida and Georgia, seen a lot of activity. But I can state also that I definitely see a difference in the scale and intensity of wildfires. And I was really interested in Dr. Lohman's speech this morning or talk this morning, and also Frank Lake's. I already learned a lot. And Frank, I wish Frank was still here. I think if I wish I'd heard his talk when I was doing my master's thesis many years ago, I probably would have changed some things. So I should go back and reconsider that. But regardless, when I talk about, I heard Jimmy say what we need. And I think about how we manage fire now probably every day. When I became a ranger about 8 years ago, someone said to me, aren't you going to miss being in fire? And being in the Southwest United States and in my position, I am always in fire, whether it be prescribed fire, fuels management, be in managing wildfire for multiple objectives. We are always involved. As a matter of fact, we have the largest wildfire managed for multiple objectives on our district at 34,000 acres, the Jack Fire in 2016. So I definitely listened with interest to Dr. Lohman's talk when she talked about when do we decide that the risk of inaction overwhelms, I wrote this down, the risk of being wrong. And I think about that probably every time we talk about whether we're going to be able to light a prescribed fire, whether we're going to be able to manage a wildfire for multiple objectives more than just suppression objective. I can be wrong as a ranger. You heard it here, as a district ranger on so many fronts. I can be wrong socially or politically or ecologically, but I think that I would also be wrong in not taking action. So how do I do my best? How do I make the best out of an opportunity? And that's with science, and been really fortunate in tech transfer. And that's really a critical component of what I do. I have to absolutely, as much as possible, pay attention to it myself, or certainly encourage the folks who I work with and work for me to do that. And we here in the Southwest and Arizona especially are lucky to work with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium. I think I saw Barb Sating-Wolfson in the group. Also, I've been able to do work with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Dr. Carolyn Sieg. And we've been able to ask very specific questions about what we need. You know, we are doing adaptive management. We're looking at very applied science. What's wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that. I've been able to work with those groups, and I think we've really been able to at least address those kinds of questions that we're seeing. Now, moving forward, what do we need? We need to continue that. You know, yesterday I spent a little time making a graph of just the amount of acres burned yearly for the last, I don't know, I think it was about the last 40 years or so. And that was in the United States. And of course, this graph shows definitely an upward trend. And that was just scale, right? That's only the number of acres. It doesn't talk about the increased severity or the increased intensity. And I think I saw that noted in Dr. Lohman's talk, where it not only talked about the scale, but also the differences in severity and how that's changing over time. And so while I can say we've been acting for, you know, the career that I've participated in fire management as fuel specialist, as a fire management officer, assistant fire management officer, we are acting, but we need to act while we need to continue to educate those actions with science. And I can only say I wish I could participate more in this conference this week, but I do rely on, as I said, the fire science consortiums and the research stations to help us in that respect. And I think that our relationship with them and also with you is going to continue to educate what we do. So look forward to the discussion that's going to continue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Linda. The wonderful perspectives, and really look forward to, again, unpacking some of the comments and challenges with you, especially on technology and education here a little bit later. But first, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Long, who is an ecologist with the Pacific Southwest Research Station with U.S. Forest Service. And Jonathan, if you want to go ahead and and present to us your perspectives. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was going to put a few slides up just to kind of reinforce things. Yeah, so I'm kind of working at the interface of science management policy. I'm currently serving as acting national program lead for tribal research. And it's nice that we have the opportunity to kind of share some of the messages that we're hearing throughout the conference in multiple sessions. Will Harling, who I think is on another panel right now, shared this photo of a burn last year at Tishonik, which is up in Frank's country. And it's an important site for action-based learning. So, you know, one of the questions we had was, what are the knowledge gaps? And I enjoyed Kevin's keynote presentation on the need for more prescribed fire science yesterday, and his interest in broadening that scope to include indigenous cultural burning, which is the topic of an article that we published this month that's on the slide here. But I would emphasize that we lack information on the long-term effects of reestablishing cultural fire regimes on a range of values and ecosystem services. And we lack long-term demonstration and research sites to better answer those questions. Among Karuk practitioners who have been real leaders in revitalizing cultural burning efforts, you know, they have a recognition that they have fewer sites where they've restored cultural fire regimes so far. Tishonik is one of them, and this is another photo of that same site getting another burn this year. But these are on private lands. We have very few examples of anything like this on Forest Service lands. Most of the examples that people talk to when referencing restoration of fire regimes in California, they point to managed fire systems in Yosemite, like Illilouette Basin, where there's been a combination of managed wildfire and prescribed burnings, or they look down to Baja California, but we just don't have examples where we've restored indigenous fire regimes to really understand what those effects could be. And so to give people hope and to explain the effects on ecosystem services, including biodiversity, we need more examples. I like this example of a site in Missouri, actually, where people could see differences of regular burning versus no burning. It was set up more than 70 years ago, and it just fills a niche that we don't see in our research natural areas in the West. So an objective would be to set up demonstration and research areas to understand these long-term effects of cultural burning in particular. And in line with this concept, we've been sketching out ideas for planning treatments in and around research natural areas that have high cultural values on the Six Rivers National Forest, rather than sticking to a non-manipulation emphasis. And I think we have some presentations that explain kind of where we're heading from a climate standpoint. If we just try to do a non-intervention approach, we're already seeing a lot of these research natural areas are getting affected by these large wildfires. Another question was about criteria for success, and I want to emphasize in a lot of our work, we want to talk about departure from desired condition and not just look at the pre-post fire conditions, because so many of these systems are very changed as a result of long-term exclusion of fire. So considering fire dynamics, biotic conditions, and social effects, including tribal cultural values. On the right here is a site figure from a study from Boisreme, who is looking at managed wildfire effects in that Yosemite area and showing increases in shrubs and meadows and aspens as a result of those fires. And so, you know, if you just look at a burn severity map, you're not going to capture this restoration processes that are happening, which otherwise are very costly to implement. So understanding where we're getting some potential benefits from fires is very important. As another example, people in Arizona where I used to work talked a lot about the Escadilla Mountain 1951 fire is a big one. There's even a sign on the right showing what the history of big aspen stands up on that mountain associated with a fire. And that area was burned again in the Wallow fire, and there was articles in the press, you know, talking about the devastation. The fire took no prisoners, torched trees, but then they talk about the blooming wildflowers and the aspen resurgence. And so there's, you know, a change, losing old growth conifers, but also sustaining aspen communities. And so in addition to emphasizing the restoration of low intensity, frequent fire, intentional fires, we want to talk about the need for restoring all sorts of fires and having this more complex understanding of our relationships to fire. So in terms of the question about new ways forward, creating a safe space for managers, one thing is to really emphasize the diversity of all these important values in all phases of fire management. And I think the Karuk Tribe commissioned the Good Fire Report that's been mentioned in a few circles. And I think it really did a great job of acknowledging the benefits of fire and its importance to tribal communities. And that's helping to build a vision for allowing a more natural and more intentional role of fire, including very frequent burning in selected areas. And this is going to be a challenge for managers like district rangers, who often have to put preventing property loss high on their list. But we want to make sure that we're communicating all these other values that are associated with fires, and especially understanding how all these factors play in at all the different phases of fire management. So there's a lot of emphasis on prescribed burning or cultural burning, but there's also opportunities to create culturally appropriate fire breaks that can be used during fires. And that's going to be increasingly important, is how do we set up these landscapes to be prepared for more fire during actual fires. In the center top here, there's a slide from a very ecologically and culturally important restoration site on the White Mountain Apache Reservation that was burned as an intentional burn during the Wallow Fire in order to make sure that the fire didn't burn through too hot through this area. And it ended up being a really nice prescribed burn for this, or not necessarily prescribed, but it ended up being a nice burn for this restoration site. In the bottom center is an example of treatments along a ridge line that they're using as a control location. This is shared by Bill Tripp, of an example where they were trimming the oaks along those areas to make it more resilient to fire, easier to control the fires, but also sustaining the oak trees that are an important cultural resource. And on the right there is an example of a prescribed burn that was done after a wildfire up in Frank's country in order to reduce fuel. So it was a kind of an alternative to salvage in that case. So all of these different emphases can be used to consider opportunities to address tribal values. Questions about partnership efforts, really highlighting a lot of the activity that's happening in California. California AB 642 in particular establishes a cultural burning liaison position and recognizes cultural fire practitioners, and really requires active engagement and partnering with tribes and tribal organizations to expand the practice and understanding of cultural burning. So this is a really important example of progress, where we contrast that with the National Cohesive Strategy, which hardly talked at all about indigenous burning, except in a kind of historical context. And so we're seeing bills now actually putting these expectations into law. And then as a final opportunity in terms of increasing capacity, we're seeing now with the infrastructure bill of 2021 calling out funding for work on pre-planning fire response workshops, including potential operational delineations, training. Here are huge opportunities with funding to really give tribes a bigger voice in fire management. And I think the challenge for us is going to be make sure that we kind of fulfill the opportunities that we have with these opportunities. But we have some efforts already underway in California, in particular around the PODS planning framework, and hopefully that these opportunities are going to do well to incorporate traditional knowledge and tribal values that we can all sustain. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Fantastic perspectives. Moving quickly through our panelists, I'd like to open up the floor for Kelly Martin, who is currently with Grassroots Wildland Firefighters and former FMO at Yosemite National Park. Kelly?
Good morning, Kevin. And I really want to thank you and Molly and the Association of Fire Ecologists for hosting this panel discussion. And I'm always very excited when we can get practitioners and scientists together on the same panel discussion, so we can really kind of do the deeper dive of what's missing and where are our opportunities. My name is Kelly Martin. I spent the last 35 years of my career working for both the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service as a practitioner. So I've come up from the ranks working in Wisconsin, Grand Canyon, here in Idaho, the Payette National Forest, Manti, LaSalle, Humboldt, Toyabe, El Dorado National Forest, and then the last 14 years of my career I moved back to the Park Service and worked as the Chief of Fire and Aviation at Yosemite National Park. The really exciting thing about moving into my capstone career position was entering that job right as the environmental impact statement was being signed to allow more natural fire to occur on the landscape. So really from 2006 to my retirement in 2019, we just really increased our scope and magnitude of allowing natural fires to occur on the landscape. So that being 95% wilderness, really in a very visible area, really was an opportunity to really intersect, both the practitioners, the scientists, and the social aspect of smoke, and a lot of people visiting Yosemite, and how we can still really promote the effective use of wildfire on the landscape, which was challenging at times, but very, very rewarding. My current efforts right now are I'm working as the president of Grassroots Wildland Firefighters, and we're an advocacy group that works with elected officials and agency senior leaders in DC to really bring attention to some of the workforce issues that we're seeing that pertains to low pay, lack of benefits, classification, mental health needs, and expanded workforce that really shifts our emphasis from suppression into more practitioner in local communities at a state level. So really excited about that. I'm also currently here in Petaluma, California, helping the Nature Conservancy, supporting local community leaders to do burning on private lands. So I'm really kind of trying to find my passions in several different areas in my retirement years. So it's been really a lot of fun, but this is really see an opportunity that's really presenting itself, especially being able to use the practitioner side back on the ground. One other effort that I'm involved with, where I first met Kevin down at Tall Timbers, is also working with Women in Fire Training Exchange. It is an offshoot of the TREX trainings that really specifically deals with trying to bring more women into this environment to really coach them and mentor them in their jobs and into the future of being very confident and competent leaders in fire management. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity as well. When Kevin and Molly asked me to be a part of this panel, I had to really think about my own personal experiences of successes and accomplishments of how I really thought the integration and the gaps between practitioners and researchers and scientists, and where that really occurred very successfully. And I will talk about when I was at Yosemite, there was a very engaged natural and cultural resource group at the park, as well as very active practitioners. So putting together what we called the Fire Management Committee, we'd meet once a month and really kind of have an opportunity to really spar with each other, but also really negotiate and compromise, both from an understanding of what can and should be done on the landscape. And this occurred both with large landscape prescribed fires, as well as natural ignitions that were occurring on the landscape, and what we actually have to, where are the challenges and opportunities, both from a practitioner and a science standpoint of view. Also, part of these successes, I think, going forward is also incorporating undergrads and grads at any opportunity to participate either in wildland fire modules, on engines, on the helitack crew while you're going to school. I just can't overemphasize how important that is to really, provide you with an opportunity to, put your skill and expertise to work, but also from the lens of a practitioner. I think in the long run, it really builds credibility with scientists and researchers who engage with us as practitioners, that yes, you have spent time on the ground, because oftentimes I've seen the conflict occur, with people that are really trying to avoid something, and us as practitioners are really struggling with trying to meet that objective. Whereas if you can bring together either, a fire management committee or some kind of, opportunity for folks to have, creative debate and dialogue, it's really super important. So what do I think about from a future imagination of where our gaps are and from a practitioner standpoint of view? I'm always trying to do everything I possibly can to think about where to put good fire on the landscape, and that's prescribed fire and the use of natural fires. And so I think about what the transition from an old suppression organization into more of a holistic fire management organization, what that might look like. Everybody that's been talking about indigenous cultural burning, I'm absolutely on board. I think that's been a missing piece in my career that I'm really, I feel it's very unfortunate that I didn't have that kind of knowledge to really build my practitioner skill set on. So I'm really very excited about that. And any time that we can build, local practitioner scientist teams, as a practitioner, invite the scientists out, scientists and researchers, by all means, if you know that there's something going on a local unit where you are living and working, by all means, contact the fire management officer and be involved early and often with some of these larger projects. As practitioners, we really need feedback. I really subscribe to, when I took my EMT, course, in my early 20s, it's first do no harm. And that has really stuck with me for applying fire on the landscape. If I'm not paying attention to the science of what I'm doing, then I also fear that I may be doing more harm than good. So having that relationship, and immediate feedback is very important. And I know from a scientist perspective, it's very hard for scientists to go, well, we don't really know everything yet, because you really kind of need that time frame to find out whether or not what we've done is actually good for the landscape. I would really challenge you to retool that and engage early, because we want to know, are we doing the right thing? And I'll give you an example that, there used to be times we'd go back through a burn unit and just continue to burn, everything in the unit. And then we had a conversation with some of the scientists and just said, if we get 40 to 50% involvement of fire within a particular unit, we're good with that, because that also increases biodiversity on the landscape. So we're thinking, well, we need to burn everything, as practitioners, and then have that really stuck with me, that, we can negotiate that, out on the landscape and understand why that's important. And then imagine cross-boundary watersheds, over time. And I do believe people are doing this, but it tends to be so difficult for agencies to think cross-boundary long-term. And I really do like the idea of thinking about whole watersheds and what can we do, within those watersheds over the course of, say, 40 to 50 years. And then start, the comprehensive planning of maybe there's timber removal or understory thinning or biomass utilization in a local community. There's any number of things to really get a lot more people involved, rather than just thinking of our own little myopic view within our own agencies. Anything that we can do, yes, it takes more work, but I think long-term, when we're thinking, biodiversity and resiliency on the landscape within watersheds, bringing more people to the table with diverse opinions and diverse views of science and research is also really good. So it's going to include mechanical treatments, large landscape prescribed fire, and the use of wildfire on the landscape. So how do we get to doing more large prescribed burns? I think, and how can research help us with that? That's a good question. I think I personally would love to do much larger landscape prescribed burning, but I'm not exactly sure where and when and under what conditions. And one of the examples I tried to do in Yosemite is we had a big, 3,000 acre unit right along the Wawona Road. It hasn't burned yet. It's in between the old Ferguson fire and some of our natural fires up further deeper in the wilderness. And so we have this classic concept of starting at the top and then pulling fire down and then stripping across the unit. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could actually develop a prescription that says, these areas, these south slopes and these southwest or western slopes in ponderosa pine are going to be very dry. come December, January, February, we can burn those off and burn them up into the snow line and burn them into a north aspect or northeast aspect. And now you've not slicked off, but you've actually treated those areas as part of your prescription, rather than saying, okay, we're going to start this burn in the fall when we're going into winter rains. And that may not be the best opportunity for that particular prescription. So I'd really like to see, more involvement with the scientists and researchers that engage from a different prescription parameter, not really think outside the box in terms of what a prescription really is. So what I hope to leave you with today is really kind of thinking about using your creative imagination as to what's possible in the future. I think it's really important that what we see emerging as prescribed burn association and all hands, all lands and indigenous cultural knowledge into our burning is really on the right track. Again, still struggle with, how do we scale this up and create an organization that is balanced with the suppression organization. So we have a lot of work to do in that area, but I'm confident that we can do that, that we can create these teams or call when needed burn teams through the Nature Conservancy and or other organizations. I think the desire's there, the skill and expertise is there. We haven't really just created that model yet. So for those of you that joined us today on the panel, I really encourage you to stay engaged and really work with the practitioners, the agency administrators like Linda Wadley. And Linda, hats off to you for changing a hat from fire to an agency administrator. And I think that's also part of our key too, is providing career opportunities for people that are towards the end of their career to function as leaders in both nonprofits, state, local agencies, to really increase the scope and magnitude of the work that's ahead of us. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Kevin. And thanks again, Molly and the Association of Fire Ecologists.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really appreciate your thoughts. Last but certainly not least is Brett Williams, who is fire management, the Department of Defense Air Force equivalent of a fire management officer at Eglin Air Force Base, where he has served as fire ecologist, prescribed fire program manager, and now fire module lead for Eglin and Tyndall Air Force Base. Brett, take it away.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. And thanks to both you and Molly for inviting me. I have a lot of slides that I'm going to click through really quickly. So I'm going to just jump right in. Whoops, that's not the first slide. Well,
But the good news is I can see it, Brett.
yeah, bad news is I can't get it to move. Try this other one. Despite my best efforts to be, oh, golly. Oh, okay, there we go. Like Kevin said, I'm the Wildland Support Module Lead at Eglin Air Force Base. I'm with the Air Force and Department of Defense. I hope I bring a little different perspective and different perspective to how we're working to address climate change and strategies we're employing. I'm at Eglin Air Force Base, which is 464,000 acres in the Florida Panhandle. It's also the largest remaining forest of longleaf pine left in the world, about 290,000 acres of longleaf pine, and the largest acreages of old growth longleaf pine left. And we're right on the coast, so we're definitely attuned to climate change, sea level rise, and the challenges that's going to bring to us. Our focus, interestingly, in Department of Defense is less on fire suppression and hazardous fuel reduction and more on compliance with the Endangered Species Act, environmental laws, and ecosystem management. So a lot of our endangered species that we're managing for, the red cockaded woodpecker and the uplands, and increasingly more herp species like the reticulated flatwood salamander, the eastern indigo snake, and the gopher tortoise. And especially those wetland, the salamander especially, we have a couple of frogs. Those wetland species we're finding are the most challenging to manage with fire, because historically we tried to keep fire out of wetlands in the Southeast because once they get in wetlands, they're very difficult to suppress. And of course, wetlands are more likely to be, well, maybe a big statement, but I have a feeling wetlands are in the species that those wetlands provide habitat for are going to be even more impacted by climate change than perhaps a lot of the upland species. Of course, everything we're doing is for the military missions, so this is also very near and dear to the military missions part as far as environmental compliance, and also they're starting a lot of fires. So how we suppress those fires, how those fires might change into the future. Also increasingly more urban interface. This is our Special Operations Command, Hurlburt Field. You can almost throw a rock to the Gulf of Mexico from Hurlburt Field. They're at almost probably 10 feet sea level here. And we're conducting burns mainly actually for habitat management more than hazardous fuel reduction. We're mostly burning for the flatwood salamander in this area. This is an example of a seasonally flooded wetland pond that historically would have been more open, grassy, diverse ground cover, but due to fire suppression and lack of focus on burning these areas, they've accumulated a lot of forest floor and duff and pine litter and so forth. So we're working really hard to restore these areas. We go in and burn the uplands in the winter typically, or early spring, so that we don't have to worry about fire escaping the pond. And then we wait till it's basically red flag conditions. It has to be almost a drought and red flag conditions, and we go light off these ponds for restoration. Started reading this article. Kevin Hires is an author on this, and it gave me pause because they modeled potential burn windows going into the future under different climate change scenarios. And what their initial results are, modeling results, were that we're going to have a lot less prescription, less days in the summer to do this type of burning, and a lot of our prescription window is going to get pushed to the winter and spring. So for a species that requires some seasonal burning in the summer, they breed in the winter, so they typically don't want us burning these ponds in the winter, and they're full of water. So I'm trying to figure out when we'll have a burn window in the future if that plays out. Maybe even more obvious is a climate change agent here is hurricanes, tropical storms. I also manage fire at Tyndall Air Force Base, which is near Mexico City and Panama City, Florida coast here. Actually, it's 2018. I put 2019, but in 2018, got a direct hit from a Category 5. It made landfall on Tyndall Air Force Base. Cost more than $6 billion in infrastructure damage, and pretty much high graded the whole forest. Anything over 6 inches in DBH was pretty much on the ground. Luckily, they did a huge salvage operation here, but it left me as a fire manager scratching my head with how do we deal with this instant fuel problem. What we decided to do is start burning as much as possible as soon as possible. We took about a year to get our burn plans rewritten because the fuels had completely changed. And that following year, we got 2 large aerial ignitions off. In those areas, we found aerial ignitions, the preferred method, just with all the blowdown and jackstrawed fuels. And real successful burn operations there. And we've just continued on in future years, or past year, we got a few more, so forth. We're just going to keep being aggressive, trying to keep that instant fuel issue down, or that complexity. So how are we approaching climate change into the future? I know you guys are all familiar with adaptive management cycle, scientific method. That's basically what we're doing. That's our approach. We're also using multiple methods, trying to isolate subjectivity by looking at either traditional monitoring methods, which we do have permanent field plots, reaching out to researchers. We've heard a lot about partnering with researchers and other groups, different statistical methods, decision support systems, bouncing the ideas off of managers to really get down over time to, how are we going to adapt strategically to this? What's happening on the landscape? What kind of change can we expect? So forth. In terms of monitoring, we have 200 permanent plots on Eglin that we sample as disturbance occurs. So we burn an area, we'll go back the following year and sample that plot. Silvicultural operation, so forth, on a rolling sampling regime. That started in 2001, so we have about 20 years of monitoring data, And we've leveraged that data to mine the data and actually work with a lot of research groups that can leverage that data for their research questions. We've done modeling and weighted overlay models to predict predict ecological condition on the landscape, both at a snapshot and over time. We've done some multivariate ordination to look at plot movement over time in relation to reference condition. And we're just now starting to dabble with ground-based LiDAR, working with Tall Timbers Research Station, and Kevin Hires really pushed that. So they're out scanning plots so that we can move to more of that kind of rapid assessment monitoring into the future. One interesting thing from some of the data mining with our monitoring plots, these are ordinations, or actually this is not our monitoring plots. This was a study done by the Jones Ecological Center in Georgia. They resampled, in the 90s, a large manipulative experiment was installed on Eglin by the Nature Conservancy, looking at various treatments and how those treatments move us towards restoration success. We were able to take those data, working with a statistician, and basically create a reference ellipse or a reference condition where 95% confidence interval that any plots that move into this reference ellipse are similar to reference. When they resampled in 2010, they found that the reference plots actually moved. So our reference plots changed in that 16-year time frame. Made us scratch our heads, think about how do we need to be looking at reference stands, reference conditions, how these might change through time with climate change. Finally, I'll leave you with a current project I'm working on, or with a CERTIP grant, Los Alamos National Lab, Adam Atchley and Elchin Jafarov, Kevin Hires, Luis Loudermilk at the Southern Research Station in Georgia, Rod Lynn at Los Alamos Lab. But a modeling approach, using habitat suitability models, longleaf successional models, and modeling various fire regimes and under various climate change scenarios, and how that may influence habitat suitability into the future for some of our key species like red cockaded woodpecker, fox squirrel, and gopher tortoise. Some real initial results, finding that we should be able to keep, as long as we keep our fire regime at a frequent level, that habitat suitability should persist. But there's still, this is in kind of midway through the project, so I haven't gotten a lot of the results yet. But kind of this multi-method approach, anybody's can come to the table, talking to partners, researchers, and universities, so forth, and co-production with these folk, with researchers, so that at the start of these research projects, the managers and the researchers sit down and develop that research to meet management relevant needs from the beginning. And that idea of co-production has really taken hold here, and a model that we like to use. I know that was quick, a lot of slides, but just wanted to kind of give a windshield tour of what we're thinking about at Eglin.
Thanks so much, Brett. It's an amazing program, and I'm privileged to have been a small part of that over the years, and really wonderful to see how it's being steered under your leadership. So we've got about 10 to 15 minutes for open questions, and there's opportunities to put questions in Whova at the app, but I have a tough time seeing them if they're not there underneath the panelist. But one of the things that Brett has brought up, and kind of maybe even a theme throughout all of the talks, is fire regimes aren't natural anymore, right? That we've manipulated them, and yet there seemed to be some reluctance to really recognize sort of the value of cultural fire regimes. But what I'm fascinated by is the diversity, or the opportunity to have a diverse management sort of palette on a landscape: cultural fire regime, wildfire use, or using wildfire for resource benefit. How do all of your landscapes, panelists, and y'all feel free to chime in, does a diverse set of fire management options give you, I guess, really that an adaptive management opportunity rather than pursuing a single strategy? Is that a theme that emerges from some of your presentations, or am I looking for it? Feel free, any of our panelists, to jump on in.
Jump in quickly and point to the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership, where they've really emphasized having the different approaches in different areas. So they're doing a lot of small scale cultural burning around cultural sites and around people's homes, setting up fuel break areas, managing oak habitat, and then they're trying to set up larger prescribed burns and kind of the next zone out from that. To take on larger areas where it's a little bit freer, and then up in the higher, backcountry, they're trying to use more managed natural ignitions, and so they're tiering all three of those things together in really creative ways and building a plan around it and using the PODS framework now to put that into action.
That's great, Jonathan. I'm almost like, you hear biodiversity equals biodiversity, but, almost think like that kind of biodiversity you're talking about equals the potential landscape resilience that we want as part of our climate adaptation strategies.
Yeah, it's actually got strong, social resilience emphasis in addition to all the ecological dimensions.
Wow. Oh, that's awesome. So there is a conversation going on in the chat right now. Molly has asked a question for any panelists, and some of you have already replied, but with the influx of new funding, infrastructure bill, plus potentially more when the final budget passes, how well prepared do you think federal agencies are to take advantage of the opportunity to fix workforce capacity limitations for treatments and adaptation?
Kevin, this is Brad. I don't know if I can speak quite to that because I'm in DOD and I don't even know if the bill applies to us exactly yet, but I would say funding is key. And I don't know a lot about how funding occurs in the other agencies, but my wildfire funding at Eglin and prescribed fire funding come out of the same pot. I can use it flexibly. I don't have to justify using one or the other. And I talk to a lot of folks on other agencies that say, yeah, I can't do it that way because it's hazardous fuel funds, or it's this type of funds. It needs to be, in my opinion, I don't know all the ins and outs of congressional budgets and so forth, but we need flexibility and be able to react quickly or be proactive quickly to apply those funds.
That's great. Thanks, Brett. Kelly?
Yeah, it's the crux of the work that we're doing with grassroots wildland firefighters. We have what's called Pillar 3, which is an expanded workforce. And, Linda also chimed in there too, in terms of, building the capacity with the science and the ologists, if you will, for a larger expanded implementation. And I think the fear is that we can't just keep throwing money at things to think that we're, as agencies, can fix this. So we got here, it's taken us like 50 years to get here with, suppression and some minor opportunities to do some prescribed burning, but we really need a fundamental different vision in a view of what the next 50 years, really looks like. If we're going to use managed fire on the landscape, we really need to boost the capacity at a local level, the prescribed burn associations at the state level, working with people that want to stay, within the state and have a decent standard of living that they can rely on by doing fields work in their local community. I've often said that people that work in suppression are pretty much tapped out or burned out by year 10 or 12. But we haven't really created that off-ramp for them to really work in their local communities to do prescribed fire and fuels work. So the money, yes, is there. My fear is that we're not going to be able to, adapt to the vision that we create. We somehow balance the $4.4 billion suppression organization with a more progressive opportunity for more burning and fuels work. I don't see people talking about that. And so that's my fear about this money influx may be wasted if we don't really think strategically about how to place that money and where that money is going to be most effective.
Great. Thank you. Jimmy?
Yeah, just an observation. My distorted view of reality is that our agencies don't give us a second to really do this hard, messy people stuff. The engagements, the getting around the table that I heard these other speakers talk about. I think that we need more time. We need more social scientists The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has, like, I can count on one hand how many social scientists we have. Who are the first positions that we cut? Typically, that's our communicators. So, you know, if we can build capacity, I would say we need more social scientists. We need more time. We need training on how to have these difficult conversations around trade-offs. So that's my observation on that thing.
You know, with the opportunity to sort of reimagine or reinvigorate the workforce, several talks, you know, or several of you mentioned really this, I think what it sounds nuanced, but it's really substantive. This change in perspective among the workforce is really moving from suppression to something more holistic, you know, from suppression to almost like conservationist or land manager, some holistic term. And Linda, I think you had mentioned that too. And I'm fascinated by that being a theme that really is, it came out of almost all the talks as being important for climate resilience. Go ahead, Linda, if you want.
I do want to jump in here really fast, Kevin, because when you say that, you know, the change in perspective and what I've seen, and I have folks now on engines, engine captains and assistant engine captains who, when we get a lightning strike, their first thought is safety. Okay, I credit my folks with a lot of expertise. Their first thought is safety, but then it's like, are we going to be able to manage this fire to do what we need to do with it? It isn't necessarily, I've got this suppression objective and I'm going to stand on this fire. So we're really fortunate that we have a change in perspective in, you want to call them the ranks, you know, in the fire ranks, and not only in the fire manager ranks, but also in our other personnel as well. So I just had to get that in there of what I have seen lately.
It seems to really jive with something that Jimmy started with, is that it seems like great managers are humble, and that humility is going to be really important moving forward. And just thinking I am a suppression resource as opposed to I am managing a resource, and sometimes that requires suppression, sometimes it requires creativity. Seems like that's another common theme among all of the managers here, is that they are humble. They insist on thinking holistically about the resources they're managing, and that honestly just seems to be such a fundamental trait of your climate resilience comments. Jimmy, do you still have your hand up? You want to jump in?
Yeah, another comment. In terms of like taking on some kind of new mindset, there are a large number of people that are beginning to talk about, do resist, accept, or direct, what's coming. And in the past, maybe the mantra was more resist, ecological transformation, or just accept it because we don't have enough money or whatever. But for some of us, like I mentioned early on, it's like, might we actually direct transformation? That's kind of scary. And anyway, so I'm going to put a link to a Park Service website that talks about this idea of actually moving from like managing for the status quo to whether or not we resist, accept, or direct ecological transformation.
That's awesome. While you're doing that, Jimmy, there's a comment from Paul Stebline who says we need a vision of where we want to be, where we want to end up with the infrastructure bill funding, and how much more will be needed to achieve desired future conditions within our wildlands. And that seems to be another common theme, which is you have to know what you want, and you have to everybody's directing it to some degree, through innovative action and monitoring the effects of that action. But do we have, as a country, do we have that desire, the desired future condition, in order to really make those RAD decision points, Jimmy? It's a fascinating question to answer. Seems like it's hit or miss. Brett, you want to jump in?
Yeah, again, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but but kind of going back to what Linda was saying, I think it's important the culture is so important. Fire culture, wherever it is, at the unit, at the region, at the national level. Obviously, we've got issues at the national level, but at the unit level, there's so much you can do to create a culture of not making suppression the primary objective and to think holistically. And I tell my firefighters that first option should always be, let's manage this fire, unless it's right on the interface. And maybe even then we do, depending on the conditions, but always think, how can we manage it first, and then think suppression. And if you can build that culture like they do at the Coconino, and a lot of other places are starting to pick that up, we got to build that culture and grow on it. Get those people to go out and be seeds to seed new areas and new culture or similar culture.
We're almost out of time. We're almost out of time. Maybe one last set of comments. Somebody jump in. Jonathan.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to some of Amy Cardinal Christensen's comments in an earlier session about really changing the framework from trying to consider tribal knowledge in action, but actually to invest in tribal communities and having the space to do more work. And I think that's one of my concerns about the infrastructure bill is there's a tendency in our federal government to spend money quickly with contractors when a new flush comes in, rather than investing and especially serving the underserved communities. So that's just my concern and comment.
Great. I've been given the permission to go over, so we'll walk back through Kelly, Jimmy, and if there are any final thoughts from Melinda, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there on Paul's. We need a vision for where we want to be at the infrastructure bill funding and how much more will be needed to achieve. The infrastructure bill only includes monetary amounts, right? Where's the effort that's being directed as to how that money's going to be spent? I think we're starting to see some of that money flow down to the ground, but we don't really have, a capital improvement campaign, if you will, as to how that money's going to be spent. And we really need that long-term vision. And maybe that happened with the National Fire Plan, and that needs to happen with the infrastructure bill. So we don't waste this opportunity. We get one bite at the apple, if you will. So I think we really need to make it substantial and make it meaningful as to how we use this money, in and around wildland urban interfaces, that phase 1 within communities, phase 2, defense threat zones, and then phase 3 out into the wildlands. I think we can do it, but I haven't seen any effort directed in that way yet. So a good question. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Kelly. Jimmy?
Yeah, I'll just add on that I think if I come up with a vision, it won't be a great vision, but if other people join me in creating that vision, then it's going to be better and it'll be more widely accepted. So I think, again, engaging with others, and I put a link in the chat there to path that we took this past spring with Alaska Fire Science Consortium, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Alaska Fire Service, and others, of like what's the vision for the future for Yukon Flats.
It's awesome. And I'm cross-posting those into the chat in Wahoo. Linda, do you want to close us out? Have closing thoughts for us?
I've got one closing thought. That's really nice of you, Kevin. And I'm going to steal from Dr. Lohman's presentation earlier this morning, and I think I'm going to stretch her definition a little bit. But she said, modeling extrapolates from the known to the unknown. And to me, that's how I need science to help me out. That's how I think we utilize it, is that we utilize science to say, okay, we have these known things. How can this help us with the unknown? And that's what I've really heard from this session. And thanks so much for allowing me to participate, and appreciate the conversation.
Well, thank you all for your perspectives and joining us today. It was really wonderful. I learned so much just listening to tell us about your situations where you work and live, and thinking about the challenges of the future to come, and how we might adapt to sustain resilient communities. With that, I'll turn it back over to Molly, or the moderator, to close us out for the afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin, for moderating this really, really fascinating discussion. And I really appreciate all of you joining in your perspectives. I hate to cut it early, but I want to put in a plug again for our fire circle tomorrow, 1 o'clock Eastern time. And hopefully that could be an opportunity to further this type of discussion. So thank you all again.
Thank you all so much. Just a very quick announcement in this final minute. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next is the poster session starting at 3 p.m. Eastern time that is centered around the Congress theme of Life with Fire, Prescriptions for Resilience. Make sure to go and check that out. And we also hope you'll join us for some great networking and discussion opportunities this evening, beginning at 5 p.m. Eastern time. There will be a few Fire Circle discussions, our annual AFI members meeting and open house, and our We've Got a Movie Sign networking session. And don't forget to participate in the Passport contest by visiting and engaging with our virtual exhibitor booths. Simply click exhibitors in the navigation bar. Attendees with the most stamps will be entered into a drawing to win a free Fire Congress registration for 2023. Thank you again to all of our incredible speakers and panelists today, and enjoy the rest of the Congress.